What's up, guys? Welcome to another Photography Basics episode. Today's episode is going to be all about aperture. So real quick before we get into that, I just wanted to give you guys a heads up for those of you who do follow me already. Last week I said that we were going to do another Q&A that was supposed to be today, but I had to postpone that a little bit because we're doing this and a couple other things. I will get to that very soon. So I will have a little bit of extended time if you guys have any questions for me regarding anything photography or YouTube or video related or anything like that, whatever. DM me those through my Instagram at Lightbenders Visuals, or leave a comment below on here or something. Just find me, comment, DM, all that good stuff, and I'll throw in some more of those if you get them in before Sunday. And if it's past Sunday already, if you're watching this in the future, you can still DM me anytime for any questions, because like I always say, leave your questions and comments below and I'll definitely answer them, because that's how I roll. All right, moving on. So, aperture. What is aperture? Aperture is part of the exposure triangle. So if you don't know, or you don't remember, or you need a refresher, the exposure triangle consists of three things. It is a triangle, and it goes like this, in a triangular form with aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. Those three things make up the exposure triangle, and all three of those things are what we use to adjust our exposure and get the right amount of light in our camera. So aperture is the first line of light coming into your camera, and that is through your lens, because what is an aperture specifically? So I brought some demonstration things for us today. So this is my 14mm cinema lens, and the cool thing about this cinema lens is it has a completely manual aperture that you control right here on the lens. This is old school. This is how they used to do it. This is how film people do it. So I'll show you guys what the aperture actually looks like. So right now I've got the aperture closed down to as far as it can go, to like f/22, and that means that it's a very small hole, as you guys can see, and we're letting in very little amount of light. That's why it looks super dark right now. So if I open this up slowly, you can see the aperture blades opening, and we're now letting in a lot more light. Now we're wide open and it's super bright because we're just letting in all of that light. So here it is again, and now you should actually be able to see it, and you can see the blades changing and opening up as I turn that. So that's it. That's what aperture looks like inside your lens, and that's what it's doing when you're changing your aperture through your camera. Alright, so let's put our props back. Okay, so that's the first aspect of aperture. What's the second aspect of aperture? Why else, as photographers, are we concerned about aperture? So the second part of it is depth of field. In addition to controlling light, aperture also controls your depth of field. So have you ever wondered how sometimes when you see pictures or certain movies or something, when not everything is in focus, and if something moves, then all of a sudden they're out of focus. And if they move back a little more, they're still out of focus. But if they find that sweet spot right there, they're in focus. So this is the other effect of the aperture that we talked about, depth of field. So right now, I've switched lenses and I put on my Tamron 45 f1.8. So in order to talk about depth of field, let's talk about what the numbers on the aperture mean. Now, technically, the numbers are a ratio, and it's a very physicsy thing, and I'm not really going to go into that right now because it's just not necessary for you guys. So, the numbers, what you need to know about the numbers of an aperture when you hear the term f-stop, or when you hear the term f2.8 or f22 or whatever, the numbers are correlating to the diameter of those blades that you saw earlier from our demonstration, and it goes from super wide open, which is a small number. So right now I'm at f2.8, which is fairly large or fairly fast. That's another phrase that we say for aperture, meaning the faster the lens, the larger the hole can go, so the smaller the number can go. So 1.8, which is what I have on here right now, is very fast. And 2.8, which I'm actually shooting at right now, is still quite fast. But then when you close it down and you go down to f22, that's a very small hole. So the correlation is the smaller the hole, the bigger the number. And the bigger the hole, the smaller the number. And that's again to have to do with the fact that it's not measuring something, it's actually a ratio. So the numbers are inversely proportionate to the size of the diameter of the blades. So that may be a little bit more technically than you need, but just take away that aperture numbers. Small number equals large hole, big number equals small hole. So big hole, lots of light, small hole, not much light. Now pertaining to depth of field, how does all of this relate to depth of field? Well, faster the lens, the larger the aperture can go, the more shallow depth of field you're going to have. So right now I'm standing in a very specific spot, but if I move just a little bit forward, because I'm at f2.8, that's a very shallow depth of field. But if I start stopping down the aperture and going to a smaller hole and that bigger number, like what I'm doing right now, eventually more things, the depth of field is going to increase and the field of focus is going to increase. So now we should have myself and a lot more of the background in focus. So now you can see the big beautiful mountains that I live in and me as well. All right, so I'm going to give you guys some happiness numbers and kind of a few guidelines for what these numbers mean and how they're going to relate to what you're going to need to pick or want to pick for your photography. So let's start with super fast and super wide, f1.8, f2, f3, f4, all of that, anywhere from 4 and lower. Those numbers are going to be great for anything that you want to soften that background and separate your subject from everything else. That's what helps lead our eyes to the subject. When all of this stuff out here is blurred away and you're only seeing the subject that you want to see clearly, that's what those real fast, big diameter apertures are for. So if you're switching gears and you want everything in focus, like you want to take a picture of this big, beautiful landscape that you're in or wherever you're at, and you want everything in focus, that's where you're going to start increasing the aperture and increasing that number for a smaller hole, bigger number, going towards f22, which is going to be the big, broad, everything is in focus. So as you start to creep up to around 5.6 and keep going up to f22, and those higher numbers, if you have a telephoto lens or whatever, then that's going to increase until gradually most everything is going to be in focus. That's not always true. We're going to talk about that special case in a minute, but generally speaking, the more things you want in focus, the smaller the hole, the larger the number you're going to want. Now, if you're trying to get the sharpest image you possibly can, like a lot of landscape photographers like to do, then there's usually a range that every lens has that's kind of a sweet spot to get the highest image quality no matter what your lens is, and that's usually somewhere between f8 and f11. So if you want those landscapes and you want the sharpest quality, or if you want the sharpest quality period, not just for a landscape or whatever, then you might want to consider using that range there from f8 to f11, because physics-wise, that's where the light is being bent the least amount as it comes into the camera, and that's going to help give you the sharpest image possible. Now, one last range of happiness numbers for you. If you guys want to try to do things like sun stars like this, then that's also an effect caused by the aperture because of the blades. So I have a more detailed video on how you can do that. If you want to check it out, it's up here. But just suffice it to know for now that that effect is usually achieved somewhere between, you can start seeing it from f10 all the way up to f22, but the best range that I've found across a lot of lenses is usually between f13 and f16. f16 is generally going to be your happiness spot for the best looking sun stars or star effect or sunburst or whatever you want to call it. All right, so one last thing, let's go back to that point where I mentioned about everything being in focus. So generally speaking, like I said, it is true that the higher your f-stop goes, the smaller your aperture is, the more things are going to be in focus. And that's true except for when you get something super close to your lens's minimal focus distance. Every lens has a minimum focus distance, which means that there is a minimum distance between the subject and the lens that it can be in focus no matter what your aperture is. So even if you have an f22, if you have something that's super close, like where my hand is, and then something way back there in the distance. Like if you want all of that from here to there, there's no physical way you can do that in camera. So you're gonna have to do something that's called focus stacking. And I have a tutorial for that right up here, and that will help you, especially if you're in the landscape business and you want to get cool landscape shots like this, where I have this super awesome spiky cactus and then I have this beautiful sunset in the background, and everything from the cactus to the background is in focus. That was done by focus stacking 3 images, focusing here, in the middle, and to infinity. So I'm not going to go into more detail because, again, I have a video for that. You can check it out and you'll learn all about how to do that. All right, so I think I should wrap it up here. I know that's been kind of a lengthy video, but there was a lot to go over with Aperture, especially if you've never heard of it and don't know what's going on, but now you do. And hopefully I've explained all the basics for what you need to know about Aperture, and hopefully now you'll have a much better understanding for what it does and how it can help you be more creative with your photography and videography. As always, if you guys have any questions about anything that I went over or didn't go over concerning the Aperture or the photography basics, leave those questions in the comments below and I'll definitely answer them. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel. I've got new videos every Tuesday and Friday. Hit that like button if this video helped you out. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.